Welcome, everyone. So glad to have you all here for our Lunch and Learn, exploring a two-eyed seeing perspective on social work with Michelle Lebrun. Michelle, as you know, if you've attended the first two sessions in this series, is completing her PhD in education and is a registered social worker and in private practice. And I want to invite everyone to join me in a land acknowledgement. And if you see at the very bottom, the chat, it'd be great if you could put in the chat where you are located, where you are joining us from. So if you go to placenames.mapdev.ca, you will find this wonderful interactive map. You can click on it, learn how to pronounce the correct name for where you are located. You can also use Google if you're having issues typing, but please join with me in the chat and acknowledge the specific land and territory where you are joining from. And we acknowledge that we, the Nova Scotia College of Social Workers, are located on the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq, whose inherent rights were recognized in the Peace and Friendship Treaties that were signed with the Mi'kmaq, Maliseet, and Passamaquoddy peoples from 1725 to 1779. This series of treaties did not surrender Indigenous land, resources, or sovereignty to the British Empire, but instead established rules for an ongoing relationship between nations. The treaties were later reaffirmed by Canada in Section 35 of the Constitution Act in 1982, and they remain active to this day. Let us take this time to pause in reflection and gratitude for the land where we live and work. The Nova Scotia College of Social Workers commits to translating this acknowledgement into action by seeking to implement the recommendations of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action, especially those regarding education. We commit to doing what we can to becoming better treaty partners. We commit to learning and to unlearning. Let us take this moment to pause in gratitude for all who have and continue to heroically care and advocate for this beautiful land. May we join them in this sacred work. Let us ground ourselves in the wisdom of the land-based Mi'kmaq teachings and values that we must all begin to learn. Let us work to decolonize ourselves, our practice, and this community that we share by working for justice for all living beings as an expression of our gratitude for being here. Let us take a deep breath and recenter ourselves away from the violent ways colonization fills our world and fills us. Let us take a deep breath and work on letting go of the unconscious bias that is everywhere, inside and out. May our session today lead us to be in right relationship with this land and with one another. And as we acknowledge the land, let us work to align ourselves with the wisdom of this planet. Thank you, Walalin. And with that, I am going to invite Michelle to unmute and share her screen. And I am so excited to learn from her, as I know all of you are.
Felix Sabug, good morning, everybody. I suppose it's after lunch, but maybe we're feeling a little tired still this morning. So my name is Michelle Lebrun. I'm really grateful to be here this morning. I just wanted to, before we start, just to light the sage here and say a little prayer for the communities, because our communities are really in need of support and prayer right now. So I just want to acknowledge how much grief is in the communities. We've had a significant amount of loss, and I just want to take a moment to acknowledge the families and to send some good energy their way and some prayers. Also for us, for coming here to get today to try to share and learn together, and we're setting our intentions and hoping that we'll have an open heart and listen with good intention, and also to maybe clear our thoughts, to speak what's wise and true and kind and loving, and also to walk in a good way with this knowledge. And so my hope is today that we'll learn how to stand together in solidarity, and be able to support one another in the work that we do, and even recognizing as social workers we carry a lot. And so my prayer is also for you guys that are listening and participating, not to be afraid to share and have some conversation, maybe some feedback as we move through the material. It's really designed to be a conversation more so than me speaking at you like I'm colonizing you. So that's really my hope today. And also just pausing for a moment here just to acknowledge the pain that the families are going through in our communities. So we could just have a moment of silence for the families. Walalia. Thank you. We'll set this aside. It's really interesting. I'll say that when I first began my PhD studies, this was really my research question. How does two-eyed seeing inform clinical practice here in Mi'kma'ki? And so I spent a lot of time reflecting about two-eyed seeing, and it's evolved since then, based on a lot of my conversations with elders. But it certainly wasn't forgotten, and it remains to be a guiding tool that I use in my everyday practice here in Mi'kma'ki. So the information that I'm sharing with you today is based on a lot of my own experience and the conversations that I've had, and some of the research in the literature around two-eyed seeing perspectives. And probably most folks here are familiar with the concept, at least. If you haven't heard of two-eyed seeing, could you just indicate in the chat box, maybe an emoticon or something? Just let me know if you've never really heard of two-eyed seeing. And we'll be monitoring the chat box as we move along. So I'm going to share my screen here. Let's just see here. Is that visible now, Nash?
It is. I'm going to ask, I see that there was a hand raised. Kevi, please feel free to put a question. This is a webinar, so we're taking questions in writing.
Yeah, and I encourage people to also write their questions as we go along, because maybe where the conversation needs to go is somewhere else other than where we're talking, or maybe there's something that I need to elaborate on. So I do invite that from the audience as well. And we'll have time for some questions at the end, hopefully, as well.
Yes.
So we're good to go?
Yes, go for it.
Okay. So interestingly enough, where are we at here? I think I might have uploaded the wrong PowerPoint here. Just looking through here. Yeah, just one sec. I just gotta make sure I share with you guys the right one, okay? How do I pull that back out of there? No,
So you can just X out. I'm going to pause our recording for a sec.
can't see nobody.
Okay, go
All
for it.
right. We had a couple of asks for the two-eyed seeing, so it depended on, I shared the wrong one, so I apologize about that. So interestingly enough, two-eyed seeing is a concept that was coined by Mi'kmaq elder Albert Marshall and his wife Merdina, and they originate from Unamagi, and two-eyed seeing is a concept that they coined, but it's important to note that it has been in application since the time of colonial history, right? The need for Indigenous people to kind of see the world from both the Western perspective and the Indigenous perspective. In its essence, two-eyed seeing is really thought of more like a tool that helps us, the user, to weave between both worlds in a way that is fluid and organic and helps us to understand multiple perspectives. And in this case, working with our people, it's really a tool that helps us to understand the Indigenous perspective as well as the Western perspective. And that was the intention of this tool in its development. Our elders would say that it does not favor one over the other, either the Western perspective or the Indigenous, but rather it is really about the user, the person that is trying to make a decision or trying to understand a concept or trying to relate in a way that is beneficial. And even as social workers, I think we're always keeping the client at the center. What is best for the client? They are the expert in their own lives. And so in trying to support our clients, two-eyed seeing is a way that we can take what we know from our own education and work experience and lived experience, and also try to understand maybe the lived experience, the worldview, the constraints, the history, etc., of our Indigenous clients as well. And when we're thinking about a way forward, we want to be able to think about both perspectives, because Indigenous people have to operate and live in a dual world. It must incorporate both perspectives in order to be successful. Does that make sense? And if you were to look at the two-eyed seeing in the literature, there's like endless applications of how this tool can be used. The only thing that I would be cautious about is sometimes we can do very surface level stuff and just take a surface level look at the other perspective and still kind of favor our own over that. It's like, oh, well, we're trying to see it from multiple perspectives, but we really haven't given it a real deep dive. And so that is the danger in using this term two-eyed seeing, is we want to make sure that we are doing the very best that we can to step outside of our own perspective and really try to understand the other's worldview, their lived experience, the history, the constraints, etc., of what Indigenous clients are going through and what we have come through. I think that's really important for us to acknowledge. So I start here by just saying that trauma in my experience is a product of colonialism. And when we think about why this in question is even important, we have to look at the context of what Indigenous clients and communities are living with. Some of the big things that have impacted our communities is the disconnection to our lands and to our traditional ways of knowing and being and living, and the resettlement onto reserved lands, the cultural genocide, even the linguistic genocide, the separation of our land-based knowledge and our ceremonies, our spirituality, the significant poverty, and even access to clean drinking water. All of these things have really created very difficult circumstances for our people on and off reserve. I just would like to add that because many of our people do live off reserve as well. So a lot of the supports and services that Canadians take for granted are not available to our people because our people fall under the care of the federal government, and the federal government lacks a lot of these types of programs, services, and funding dollars, etc. So this has created and deepened, the poverty gap in our people. The internalized trauma that has resulted from things like residential schools, day schools, the 60s scoop, the ongoing missing and murdered, etc., the things that we're still contending with today, has resulted in higher rates of suicide and violence, addictions, homelessness, and so forth. It really is a product of trauma, and that's why I wanted to mention that this is why two-eyed seeing in these different perspectives are really important, is because we have to acknowledge why things are the way they are in our communities today. And also to just pause and take a moment to reflect that this has been 531 years of colonial violence on our communities here in Mi'kmaq, especially on the East Coast. And it was not always this way. And prior to colonialism, our communities were very healthy and vibrant and organized, and we had strong senses of spirituality and family and communities. And so as we engage in our healing work, as Indigenous people, it's important for us to understand that we're still working through the product of colonialism and trauma. And also just to mention that Indigenous people are not just their trauma. We are not just our trauma. We have great resiliency and we have great strengths and gifts and so much to offer our communities. And so Indigenous people are the ones that really are the experts in their lives and know what they need for this healing work to happen. So over the centuries, much has impacted the mental health and well-being of Indigenous people. And when we think about trauma, we are reminded that trauma is not the event itself, but it's the lasting results of what the trauma does to the individual or the community or generations, which is referred to as intergenerational trauma. The frequency, intensity, and the support systems that are available to our people is really key to resiliency, and also the ability to overcome challenges and break that really intense cycle that we see so many people not succumbing to, but experiencing. So intergenerational trauma is clearly seen in our people today. It's the result of generations of colonialism, racism, oppression, and cultural genocide. Trauma experienced by Indigenous people does get internalized and passed down to descendants in various ways, physically, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually. And that is why the two-wide seeing perspective is really important, because the Western perspective does not always include that holistic approach, especially in terms of our spirituality. The result is often depression, anxiety, compound grief, all sorts of I guess, products of colonialism. And as a mental health clinician, what I see clients most for are things like clients often feel that their practitioner does not get their lived experience or does not include like their perspective in their treatment plan. It's very difficult to understand complex intergenerational trauma. Also, high levels of anxiety and depression, probably all things that we all see. This feeling of helplessness and hopelessness, and feelings of suicidal ideation, complex frequent grief. So for example, in my community here in Pictou Landing, we've lost 10 people here in just this one community in the last 8 months. And because our communities are so interconnected, what happens in one community is felt across multiple communities. The loss of culture, language, and ceremony, and the connection to the lands and waters. It's not just about hunting and fishing and praying, but it is really about that spiritual, energetic connection that we've had for thousands of years, and still have that genetic memory within our bodies and in our spirits. So we feel that disconnection, the loss of families, what residential schools and oppression and so forth has done to our communities, to break down healthy senses of relationships, etc., which has resulted in high rates of family violence, etc. The ongoing assault of our children being removed into care for reasons that, a lot of things are, again, a product of this colonial violence on our communities. And also, just recently did a workshop on anti-trafficking and exploitation here in Nova Scotia, and they shared a staggering statistic with the group. They said that 51% of those that are that are trafficked have also been in care. So the connection of being in the child welfare system and human trafficking and exploitation. So we know, like, even though the Canada population is made up of 4% Indigenous, it represents over half of the children that are in care. And of that half that are in care, 51% of those here in Nova Scotia end up being exploited or trafficked all over the world, really. So racial discrimination, barriers, and violence, those are the types of things that I'm seeing as a clinician. And the reason why I was moved towards two-wide seeing and Indigenous perspectives was because I felt like when I came out of social work education, a lot of the theoretical foundation that I had really wasn't working with my clients in communities. I really needed to broaden my perspective, and I needed to take the time to learn from our elders and from our community about what was going to be helpful in supporting Indigenous clients. So hopefully today we will have a foundation of what two-wide seeing is and how it can help us in the work that we do as social workers. It's important because we have ethical considerations as well as everybody wants to do a good job. We want to feel like we're fighting for social justice and overturning a lot of these hurtful ways of the past. We're entrusted with the health and well-being of our clients. And the research shows that even though the health disparities between the Indigenous and non-Indigenous people is widening, the programs and services and the things that we're doing to close the gap is not working. So we need to find a new way to move forward. So Indigenous worldviews can give meaning not only to research, but the work that we do as social workers. It reduces risk of harm to our people. It makes research and work more meaningful and applicable to our communities as well. And of course, we're all familiar with the standards of practice and ethical guidelines, so I won't review that. And as we said, navigating between the Western and Indigenous worldview is a daily task for Native people. And by gaining this perspective, or at least learning to use this tool, it dignifies and it legitimizes how important the Indigenous worldview is. It will help us in the work that we're doing. So I wanted to say that it's not just for the Indigenous people, it will also help us to do our work. It will reduce the feelings of burnout or the feelings of not doing our work in the best way that we can. It's reducing harm, and therefore we're going to have more satisfaction and more, we're going to feel better about the work that we're doing as well. When we don't have a dual perspective, a two-wide seeing perspective, the result can be harm to the communities that we serve. And it's important to realize that the Indigenous ways of knowing and being is a valid way of moving forward. It for so many decades and hundreds of years, only the Western perspective has ever been advanced. And Dr. Batiste, another Mi'kmaq elder from Unama'ki, would say that this has resulted in cognitive imperialism, where it's where your history and your ways of knowing and being and your language and all your knowledge systems have been silenced and dismissed, and Western perspectives have been unquestionably pushed forward as the valid way of knowing and being, and the only source of valid knowledge, then that results in a state of cognitive imperialism for our people. So it has never been more critical that we start to gain in a two-wide seeing perspective in the work that we're doing as social workers. It is necessary because the Western perspective really is limited, and it does not truthfully or justifiably deal with the complexities of colonialism and all of the assumptions that go along with it that can create this situation where we're forced to make decisions, and sometimes we don't have the two-wide seeing understanding of a situation, and so we have to make a decision, and sometimes that decision results in harm with our clients and communities that we're working with. So Western institutions have failed to fully value and recognize the validity and importance of Indigenous worldviews and knowledge. And also, it's not just the fact that all of that has been dismissed, it's also been that Indigenous people are often portrayed as deficient subjects rather than peoples capable of self representation and shaping education through your own knowledge system. So, as we work together towards this healing work, we will see more Indigenous knowledge coming more readily available, even to our own communities. We're having more conferences. We're gathering our knowledge keepers and our elders. We're sharing knowledge. We're bringing back our ceremonies. We're bringing back all of that connection to the land and so forth. And I encourage social workers to take any opportunity that they may have to learn, to open their hearts wide to any opportunity that they could experience any of this learning. So we won't need to revisit a lot of the Western perspective because we're all familiar with that. But I just want to introduce you to some other ways of knowing and being, some concepts that are very familiar here in Mi'kmaq. So for example, Imsa Nogama, you might have heard this term, or you might have heard people saying all my relations. And what does that really refer to? Is it referring to all my relatives? It is important to acknowledge the connection that we have with everything in creation, not just our family, but also our communities, our our people, all creation all around the world. We're all interconnected, and we all have this impact on one another, like an energetic impact. And it also encompasses the past, the present, and the future, our ancestors, our future generations, our people, the people that are here now. And it is all encompassing. I can't really say that word. But Imsa Nogama is a way to acknowledge the interconnection of every part of creation, whether you're an animal or a plant or that rock or our ancestors or our future generations, etc. And it's not just an Indigenous thing. All creation is related. And that's what we're referring to for Imsa Nogama. And for Indigenous people, having that in context understanding is really important to the Indigenous worldview. And the Western perspective is often thinking of things in isolation, almost like that woman, that dog, that person, that this. But in our perspective, things are always energetic and spiritual and flowing and ebbing and changing. And that perspective is always that individual in context to something bigger. So that woman in context to her husband, to her kids, to her community. And so that is something that's really ingrained from the time we're brought into this world, probably even in vitro. So Imsa Nogama, that's a really important one. Ulnuidism, the Mi'kmaq way of knowing the world. It's almost like the thinking, the way that Indigenous people think and learn the world. It's a very different concept because in the language, it is in English, it's very noun based, and in Indigenous language, Mi'kmaq language, it's always that spiritual, energetic connection. And so that Mi'kmaq way of thinking about the world is deeply ingrained and weaved through the language that we use. And English does not always it's very difficult to translate the Mi'kmaq way of thinking and knowing into the English language. The medicine wheel teachings, it is about that interconnection between the physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual, and the importance of being balanced. And so when we think about the world, when we think about everyday life, when we are trying to make decisions, when we think about wellness and so forth, that balance and interconnection between the physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual must always be considered. Also, a two-wide perspective values story sharing as a valid source of transferring knowledge and also doing teaching. And so you may recognize that when you're working with Indigenous clients, that they may tell you lots of stories and give you lots of information, and maybe in our professional experience, it might even feel like oversharing, but those details are very important to that individual. And sometimes we have to listen very carefully with an open heart to try to hear the meaning behind the story. But story sharing is so common in the way that we transfer knowledge and the way that we share our lives. And so with our clients, be open to that form of working with them. Our land-based knowledge, that's cannot be overemphasized. The connection to the land, plants, water, and all creation, the celestials are creator. And not that all people are even traditional or follow one particular path spiritually, but the connection to the land and so forth is a teaching that we have from the time that we come into this world. And so these are really beautiful ways that we can incorporate two-wide seeing perspective in mental health and social work that we do. The importance of ceremony. Sometimes as social workers, we may not feel like this is our place, and we don't have to be an expert in this field, but being able to connect our clients back to those who may be able to facilitate their learning, or to connect them to ceremony, or just to have those teachings ourselves, be open to learning from our elders and knowledge keepers and ceremonial people in the community. This will help us to have a two-wide seeing perspective. We have to decolonize the way that we think about social work and working with our clients. And of course, everything doesn't have to be serious. Like there's so many things to celebrate, such as our Mawiomis, arts and crafts, so many different talents and gifts that our people bring. And it's all there for our teaching. Those are things that if we're invited as social workers or as people working in community, those may be things that we get to learn and experience. And they can be great. They can be even great for our own mental health and our well-being as well. And we talked a little bit about language, and we talked about the importance of energy and spiritual perspectives. When we think about the different frameworks that we have about understanding social work, we have lots of different theories. We have anti-oppressive theory, we have structural theory, we have feminism, we have lots of different ways of thinking about stuff. And in the Indigenous perspective, the way that we're looking at, the way that we need to also include in our tool bag is also that concept of things are energetic and spiritual. And I would encourage you guys to read Eduardo Duran's Healing the Soul Wound, because he would say that this colonial history that has been the assimilation and all of the things that we've gone through has resulted in what he refers to as a soul wound. And the healing journey is the retrieval of your soul. So it's like a soul retrieval process. And he would refer to therapy as a form of ceremony. So those kinds of concepts are really helpful with some of our Indigenous clients and communities. And I'm mindful of the time. Are we doing good there, Nash?
You are doing great, and this is being recorded so that it's okay if you run a little bit over, and people, if you miss some of it, it'll be on our YouTube channel. There
Okay.
was a question though, what was the title and author? Eduardo Duran,
Duran.
and that's Healing the Soul Wound. And
Yeah.
as an aside, since I'm talking, and this question's coming up, and this is not the first time you have made this recommendation to our members, I am thinking that we are going to maybe invite a book club, and perhaps you could help facilitate that conversation. So y'all, you heard it here first. Please feel free to start looking for the book now, because we are going to put a call out and invite people to read it. And clearly it is an important concept to begin to think about. Our decolonizing committee, which Michelle is co-chair of, may eventually have other books that they will want to have us read, but I think we'll start with this one.
Okay, excellent. So just a little bit mindful of what happened there. Did I go off the screen there? One sec, okay. Okay. So we must decolonize knowledge systems, our ways of thinking about the world, because in the Indigenous worldview, and because of this colonial history, a lot of our work has not been published, right? So we're getting there, we're gaining momentum, but for now, a lot of our knowledge is not something you're going to really read in a book, especially our ceremonial knowledge. That is not to be recorded in any way, and or photographed or anything like that. So ceremonial knowledge is something that you have to show up and you have to do. You have to be present. And honoring the ways that we have transferred knowledge for so many thousands of years is really important. So it's with the too wide seeing, we look at it as complementary and not competitive or contradictory, not thinking, oh, this perspective, this is the best thing for that person, or that perspective, or my perspective is the best. We have to kind of go back and forth and figure out what are the needs of the client and what is the best approach. And does the client agree to that? Do they buy into the treatment plan? Do they see it as something that they would like to try? And give them multiple options, multiple things to think about, and invite them to maybe share their perspective, an Indigenous perspective on it. And when they do, we want to validate their worldview. We want to also challenge our own, our own limitations of the way that we see the world and what we may think is best for that client. Okay. So, too wide seeing, it encourages the user to include the physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual dimensions. I just had a little note here that for Indigenous people, medicine is not just like maybe a physiotherapy or prescriptions or so forth. Like for our people, a too wide perspective is really using our plant medicines, story sharing, singing with our drum, could be chants, could be prayer, could be doing a ceremony, like it could be smudging or using our medicines. And those things are all valid forms of what we would call healing. And there's so many more as well. Could be making our ribbon skirts, it could be beading, like those are all valid forms of when we talk about healthcare or wellness or well-being. I just had a little note there about sweat ceremonies, like it's used to cleanse toxins from the mind, to clean the mind, body, and spirit, to purify people, places. Like it's an energetic, spiritual healing, and there's so much that can be gained from that. So I was just giving a couple little examples of what wellness and health and spirituality kind of look like from our perspective. Two-eyed seeing also is being open to not just people that we would consider the experts in our field. Like it would not just be people that have a certain amount of education or work experience or a work title, but it would also include people like our elders, our knowledge keepers, our healers, people who hold the language, ceremonial people, and even folks that we look up to in our Maui community, like could be dancers or people that have land-based teachings and so forth. And it's really important that we include these ones in our work as much as we can, because they hold that knowledge of what a two-eyed seeing perspective is really about. It's not about education and expertise. It's really about the connection to the community, spiritual connection, energetic connection, people that we trust in our communities, people that have knowledge of the past, and that connection to be able to pass that knowledge on to others in a really good way. So two-eyed seeing allows for flexibility. It allows us to consider multiple perspectives, and it honors Indigenous knowledge alongside Western knowledge. It does not favor one over the other, but it also does not discount the importance of Indigenous knowledge. It doesn't diminish it in any way in light of Western knowledge. So that kind of gives us a broader view of two-eyed seeing perspective. It's really just an introduction to the concept. But what I would like you guys to take away from this is that it is a tool that can help us to weave between both worlds. It's not favoring one over the other. Rather, it's helping us to facilitate a conversation with our client or community to try to determine what we together, working together, see as the best way forward. But of course, that can always change. Once we start doing the work, we may need to adjust. We may need to bring in a little bit more of this in or a little bit more of that in, and that's okay. But it's about being open to both perspectives and valuing both the Indigenous and Western knowledges and perspectives. So, Walalia, thank you all for joining me today, and I'll take questions at this time.
Okay, well, Walalan to you. I'm going to open this up to everyone. If there are questions, you can put it in the Q&A, or if there are other questions. I see one from Lindsay. I attended a training yesterday on resource tapping, which is linked to EMDR, and the facilitator talked about tapping for bilateral stimulation that can be connected to a certain rhythm that people are naturally connected to. This reminded me of drumming and the roots of some of these Western therapeutic practices. I am personally very interested in what you just shared, and I would be very interested in Michelle's thoughts on that.
Yeah. Well, you know, the drumming is it represents the heartbeat of Mother Earth and our mother. It's like it's the sound that we're all familiar with, and so uh, it's more than that's why we consider it a medicine, right? Because it's taken us back to that connection that we have, that spiritual, energetic connection that we have to our mother, Mother Earth, and our physical mother too. And if you think about in vitro, when a woman is carrying a baby girl, how many generations are there connected together in vitro during that time? She's connected to her mom, her grandmother, herself, and she has her eggs within her. So I mean, like it's all of those connections all in vitro, right? And it's very, very powerful. So when we think about this drum, it's more than just a song or a music. It's actually a medicine, and so we can certainly resonate with that. So that's very interesting. I like that. Thank you.
Thank you. And if there are no other questions, just abundant gratitude to you. I'm going to stop the recording.